This is the tale of The Doll's House by Rumer Godden, with illustrations by Jane Ray, read by Sascha Cooper. On behalf of Quarantine Kids Storytime, we would just like to say a huge thank you to the Rumer Godden Literary Trust and Jane Murray Flutter, Rumer Godden's daughter, for granting us permission to read The Doll's House. If you'd like to know more information about Rumer Godden's works, you can visit the Literary Trust's website, www.rumergodden.com. I will also put this link down in the description box for you. Thank you once again for tuning in, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the adventures that Totty and her friends have. Enjoy. Chapter 6. Totty and the Doll's House were not the only things in the house that had belonged to Emily and Charlotte's great-grandmother and great-great-aunt Laura. There was as well a sampler.
"What is a sampler?"
asked Apple. It is a needlework picture to hang on a wall, Totty explained to him. It is all worked in cross-stitch on fine canvas, and sometimes, most times, the stitches are very fine indeed. Do you remember in the Tale of Gloucester, asked Totty, when it says, the stitches were so small that they could only have been made by mice? Well, the stitches in samplers look like that, but they were not made by mice, said Totty. They were made by little girls, and hours of stitching went into them. They had letters and alphabets and a great deal of writing. I remember them well, said Totty. I feel glad that little girls do not have to make them now, said Totty. Great-grandmother's sampler hung in the children's room. It was long in shape and framed in a narrow wooden frame. It was worked in baskets of flowers on a cream background, and it had a verse that said in tiny pale blue stitches, "Fain am I to work these nosegays, gathered from my tranquil days, in gentle rain, mild storm, and sunny weather, a friend to flower, flesh and fur and feather, content, please God, my time on earth to dwell, till death shall claim me, and I say farewell." I remember those F's, said Totty. They gave her a great deal of trouble. Charlotte did not like to look at the sampler. She said it gave her a headache, and she did not understand the poem in the least. But Emily liked it. Sometimes she begged Mother to give her a certain little set of clothes, Totty's first clothes, as old as the sampler. These clothes were not beautiful ones like Marchpane's. They were the ordinary clothes that might have been made for any little doll in those times. A bodice with infinitesimal tucks where stay-bones should have been, a pair of long-legged drawers scalloped to match, and a dress of India muslin embroidered in blue flowers, and a very little blue bonnet to match that had white embroidery that looked like quilling on the edge. Emily liked to dress Totty in these and stand her underneath the sampler.
"Let's put her there today, Charlotte," said Emily next afternoon. "Mrs. Innisfree is coming to tea."
Both the children loved Mrs. Innisfree, who was gay and serious as Nida Rose, and who was always interested in their dolls. Emily dressed Totty and stood her under the sampler, and even wrote a ticket that said, not unlike the cleaner's notice for Marchpane, "Example of a real sampler, worked by a little girl in 1846. Poor little girl, said Charlotte indignantly. Emily took no notice. She wrote, "Example of a farthing doll, dressed by that same little girl in 1846. Her mother must have helped her, said Charlotte. No little girl could make that quilling. You ought to put in about the mother, Emily. Well, I shan't, said Emily. It spoils the notice. There was a sound of footsteps outside the door, and Mrs. Innisfree came in. She admired Totty and the sampler, and she admired the doll's house, and she sat down by the fire and listened to the whole story of it. "It's a pity about the chairs and couch," said Mrs. Innisfree. Emily told her about the set in Wigmore Street, and then she and Charlotte fell silent. "They sound the very thing," said Mrs. Innisfree. "Will you buy them?" "No," said Emily. "No," said Charlotte. "At least, not yet," said Emily, with a far-away look in her eyes. "I see," said Mrs. Innisfree, and her eyes went to Totty. "It is strange," she said, "that you should have arranged Totty like that for me to see." "I am having an exhibition," said Mrs. Innisfree. "At least a part of it is mine. It is called Dolls Through the Ages, and it is to help the Blind Children's Fund. I wonder if your little doll and sampler could be in it." "You mean just as they are now?" asked Charlotte. "Example of a real old sampler worked by a little girl in 1846, poor little girl. An example of a farthing doll dressed by that same little girl in 1846. Only you ought to put in about the mother doing the quilling," said Charlotte. "Yes, I mean that," said Mrs. Innisfree. "I think your mother would let you. And," said Mrs. Innisfree, looking at Emily and Charlotte, and at the shabby little chairs and empty windows of the doll's house, "we pay for some of the dolls, and I should like to pay you for Totty." When Totty heard these words, she gave a little gasp, but no one heard her. "How much would you pay?" Charlotte was saying. "Would you pay a whole pound?" "Charlotte!" said Emily, and tried to kick her gently on the ankle. "But we need a whole pound," said Charlotte. "We should pay a guinea," said Mrs. Innisfree. Totty gave another sound, and this time it was a groan, but Apple was tugging at her skirt. "How much is a guinea?" whispered Apple. "A pound and a shilling," said Totty faintly. "Mrs. Innisfree is giving that for me. Oh, oh!" "That would be enough," said Charlotte, nodding her head. "After 100 years," said Totty. "Then will you let me take Totty and the sampler away?" asked Mrs. Innisfree. "Take Totty away!" cried Mr. Plantagenet, and stopped. "Totty going away?" asked Birdie. "Totty go away?" asked little Apple, and he said firmly, "No." "Now, Apple—" "No, no, no!" cried Apple. "It is to get the chairs," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Don't want any chairs." "Now, Apple—" "I don't want any either. Bother the chairs," said Birdie. "Can't we sit on cotton reels? They would do." "We have to have elegant chairs," said Mr. Plantagenet slowly. "Here is a good way of Totty earning them." "Isn't it like Totty," asked Mr. Plantagenet, "to be the one to earn us a couch and chairs, and the table with the runner, and the real lace curtains perhaps as well?" Totty said nothing at all. She stood as if, instead of being wood, she had turned to stone, and when Emily picked her up and wrapped her in white paper to be given to Mrs. Innisfree, Totty lay cold and heavy in her hand. Emily felt misery and reproach from Totty, but she did not understand why. Can you guess why? Totty was wrapped up and packed in a box, the box laid on top of the sampler with the 2 notices, and they were all handed to Mrs. Innisfree. "Oh no, poor Totty! What's going to happen to her at the exhibition? Tune in tomorrow to find out more. My name's been Sascha Cooper, and this has been The Doll's House by Rumer Godden. Take care, everybody, and stay safe. Bye-bye.